space. Linda is definitely competitive out there. Now Linda is now LinkedIn Learning. And I just recently, I would say in the past week or so, they seem to be doing more investment in the learning area based on some of their announcements that they did at their big event. I think it was last week or the week before. That's one that would worry me for Skillsoft because it is so tightly tied in with LinkedIn and then, of course, tied in with Microsoft. LinkedIn hasn't done much with that learning from Linda yet, but there is a huge amount of opportunity for them to do something there and certainly to push that into the business-to-business space. Since everybody has Microsoft, most people have Microsoft on their desktops, you can see where they could do some real tie-ins there. So that's a competitive threat. On the IT developer side, I mentioned Pluralsight. They're a big competitive threat in that part of the business. And then as you look at other areas of content, like leadership, they get competitive pressure from Harvard. Harvard Business Review has a number of digital products that compete with Skillsoft leadership products. And again, that goes to just the brand name recognition and the cachet that goes along with Harvard. So, I'm sort of mentioning all these different vendors. They kind of come in and I was going to say bite at the heels, but in many cases go head-to-head with Skillsoft for the dollars in those different areas. I can't think of too many vendors that go in, as we mentioned, at the broad range of things, but definitely come in at that lower level. There's some other vendors that are out there that are positioning in different ways. Grovo, their thing was focused on micro-learning. I can't remember if they've been acquired by somebody recently. One thing I will say, as you're looking at this, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, there's a lot of acquisition that goes on in this market. These different companies, small ones pop up, somebody acquires them, they fold it into what they're doing, and then somebody else pops up and does something all the time.
Who's Skillsoft's biggest competitor, direct competitor?
I would say you'd have to go into the different collections. I would not say there is one biggest competitor right now. So for IT, it would be Pluralsight. For general across the board, I think Degreed is a very big competitor with them, even though they don't compete directly on the content. Another one that I would worry about right now is Cornerstone, which is interesting because, again, they're not a content vendor. They are a platform company, but they recently announced a content offering where they are allowing companies to come in and purchase content through Cornerstone. I don't know if Skillsoft is playing in that market. I haven't seen any announcements that they are. Cornerstone was one of Skillsoft's bigger resellers. But that announcement from Cornerstone is interesting because it really does further commoditize the market away from these big, broad collections and down to just buy what you need. So that would be a big competitive threat right now that I would see.
So given that you mentioned that there is no player as big as Skillsoft, who would be, or would you think there would be any potential strategic acquirer for a company like Skillsoft?
Yeah, I've thought that for a long, long time, and I'm actually surprised that nobody's done it yet. Much like, LinkedIn and now Microsoft have Linda, that gives them an opportunity to put this broad content into a lot of places. When I think about the Skillsoft content, sort of taking compliance out of the mix because that is a different animal, I always thought somebody like an ADP would be really interesting, right? Where they offer all of these business services. If you think about how they might be able to bundle learning into that and offer that up as part of what they provide to businesses, I think that would be really interesting. IBM would be interesting. Sort of big, broad range players that have offerings in an HR type of space. It feels natural to me that you could take learning and put that into it somehow. Now, I don't know, I guess the question for those companies would be, is it either enough of an uplift on, what they can sell to their customers, or is it enough of a value add that it's worth the purchase price?
Can I ask, this is not along the same theme, but if you were to invest in this sector and you were looking at one of these e-learning players, what are the key performance metrics or key questions you would be asking of that company or information you'd be needing to see in their underlying financials and whatnot?
Yeah, so I definitely want to look at renewal rates and any churn numbers. I mean, those are obvious. One of the things I'd want to see is what is the ongoing investment level in the content itself? Because the market does shift and change. So Skillsoft very publicly, did heavy investment into their content library. I'm trying to think how long ago it was now. 3 years, probably 3 years ago. The content was getting dated. It was getting old. People were complaining about all the things I mentioned before. The executive team that had been brought in by Charterhouse talked very publicly about making big investments, which they did. They revamped a lot of the content. I have not seen much talk about that yet, and that would worry me. So I would want to know what's the ongoing investment that you're putting into the content, because if you're not, it gets dated fast. Or if not, why? What is the rationale behind not putting ongoing investment into that?
And what would you think, from your viewpoint of where you worked within Skillsoft, is actually a good, a good amount? Like, let's say headquarters would say you're allowed to invest X amount in content. Maybe that's not one that these.
Or more like, what's the competitor? Is there like competitors, they invest a certain amount of their profits or revenue in content every year? Or I think that would be the number I would look at. And I know, like, I keep going back to Pluralsight, but so specifically that IT industry, that requires an ongoing level of investment. Otherwise, you're going to get behind, right? Because development things change so fast. There's new languages that come out. There's new software methodologies that are coming out. Like, you have to keep on top of that. Otherwise, you're not going to have what people need. So you could look pretty directly at, what's the investment level Skillsoft's doing there? What's the investment level that Pluralsight is doing there? Other topics are more what I would call evergreen. So communication skills are kind of communication skills. You might not have to update them as frequently, but I would say, you've got to be updating it every few years, especially if it's video, just to make sure that it looks contemporary. It looks like what people expect it to look like. So that would be a big one.
That was very helpful. So you named, renewal rates, the churn numbers, ongoing investment level, and the content. Is there any other thing that you'd be also focused on looking at?
I'm trying to think from a financials perspective. I mean, obviously, investment into the platform as well. And I would also look at, so they released a new platform called Percipio, probably about a year and a half ago, because I put that into the market just before I left. I would ask some questions around the rate that people are moving over to that, and I would also look at the financials on that as a product and see where that sits right now, because that is relatively new. So I'd want to see that was actually growing, and that they're able to move people off their older systems onto the newer one.
Just in terms of, we talked about what to look at. I mean, for me, I guess it's also understanding, when you have your products, does it make sense to look at the underlying verticals, like how much is compliance, how much is like leadership courses? I mean, some is more sticky than others, I would assume. So understand where.
I would definitely do that. And like I said, like you mentioned compliance, that's a very different kind of market. And I'm not as familiar with the compliance market as with the other ones, because it's different points. It operated sometimes more as its own business. But that one, that always felt like it had more growth potential to me.
And how should we look at growth? I mean, we're looking at the e-learning businesses, we're looking at modeling these businesses. How do these businesses, I mean, I don't know if you looked at industry growth rates and company growth rates, but
how do they normally grow year on year? I mean, are they just flat because they have the same contracts? Do they grow in line